I might be judging the fourth Harry Potter movie a bit too harshly, especially given the direction the following movies take, but we'll get to that in the next couple of videos. It is, however, a shame to see the vibrancy that the other films had dissipate in the fourth film. I feel like it has a lot to do with the cinematography, but this is also a time when digital processing was becoming more advanced, and it's hard to tell who can take credit for the final look of the film as it relates to color and texture. And while it does have a lot of promising characteristics that even I enjoy and appreciate in cinematography, such as its use of colorful lighting, it somehow feels lacking. Where the first three films had this vibrancy to them, the fourth somehow seems dull, even next to the third one, where both the cinematographer and director went for a duller palette. To learn more about that film, check out my most recent video. As we flick through the clips and stills from today, it's important to keep note that there's more than the color and cinematography that determines the look of a movie. Sometimes the sets, exteriors, digital team, and even the blocking can make a scene feel more or less dreary. What I'm primarily concerned with this deep dive is the lighting, its quality and motivation, and most importantly, the final look of the film, which, as I said before, can be more and more attributed to the colorist and post-processors than the cinematographers nowadays. We'll look back on a number of scenes from earlier films to see key differences and look ahead to see how the movies progress, but all in later videos. For now, let's jump into the analysis.
As if you could outrun me!
We're going to start today already in the color page with the vector scope pulled up as we flick through these images. And it's important to note some of the characteristics of the color. You can see it both with your eye, but sometimes it's misleading until things have been corrected. But throughout a lot of these images, as I mentioned in the intro, there's both very colorful lighting, but also some artificial introduction of colors that I sometimes think looks nice for certain films, but sometimes I think feels a little bit too arbitrary, and in this case, I think doesn't quite fit. I'm going to start with the most egregious and most obvious characteristic of the film, and it's going to be through this shot right here. I'm going to full screen it for you guys, and as you can see, I just had two nodes. I'm going to toggle them both off right now. This is the image as it appears in the film, and this is the image as I have made some adjustments to it. The thing that I'd like to emphasize with this isn't that a grade like this is necessarily right or wrong, but more so that I feel like it lacks motivation and doesn't quite fit the characteristics of the film as it was established in the three films prior. I'll show you what I'm doing in these correctors, and then I'll jump over to a couple other stills so that you can see the consistency across all the images. This is just a saturation node. I've cut it on to emphasize the corrections that I've made here, and these are the corrections here. Just using offset and pulling it up to magenta, I was able to take all this green undertone that exists in the film and pull it back to something a bit more neutral. And if we jump over to a number of other clips here, I'm going to show this adjustment kind of pulled over to the other clips to show that this is a consistency among all the images in this film. And I'm emphasizing that with a saturation node as well as a corrector node. So here is full correction, and this is before. The purpose of this, like I said, isn't to emphasize that one is better than the other. It's to determine the underlying characteristics of the film. And only by correcting something toward neutral can we begin to understand where the color is going in the film. And so this one we can see before the adjustments, we can see this green kind of haze that permeates the entire layer. A lot of that is being motivated by this bluish green light here that kind of seeps into the background. We can also see just how desaturated everything is, something that becomes more and more prevalent as the films go on. But with that corrector node, we can see how much punch is kind of being drawn out of the image, and we can eliminate a lot of that green haze just by introducing some magenta, and that kind of rests the entire image into something a little bit more neutral. It's the same case with this image, and kind of what gives it away is if you start to look into the shadows, the deeper regions of the image, what should be otherwise an area that shouldn't have a color cast, you start to see the color that's being introduced kind of artificially, and that's kind of what's happening here. You can see down in these darker regions under the wing here, if we just push everything a little bit more toward magenta, this is how it might have appeared on the day, and this is kind of what they've went with for the final color pass. And especially with this one, we can see everything's pushed really toward green. It's almost hard to notice this when you're watching the movie in sequence and your eyes kind of adjust. But once everything is corrected, you can see just how green this entire film is. And I think it's a little bit too artificial for my taste. Before we wrap everything up, I mentioned that I wanted to look back at Prisoner of Azkaban so that we can compare it to some of the cinematography and the techniques used in Goblet of Fire. I want to point out this scene in particular and compare it to a scene in Goblet of Fire. And I want to make note of the way the camera is moving, the lens choice, and the motivation of light, as well as the type of light. So, the biggest thing to take note of here is that this is primarily shot on wider glass. I remember when I did the analysis for this movie, they primarily used, I think it was up to 14 millimeter, around 24 millimeter in that range. I think it was a 14, 16, 18, maybe a 20, 24. But the idea was to reveal as much of the environment and the relation of the students in that environment as possible. It really helps to establish the world, to show off some of the details, and then also to always show the students' relation to one another inside of the world. So, what we're seeing here could be attributed largely to the cinematographer, but mostly to the director's style, the way that he's blocking this scene, the way that the characters are interacting. Even with this interaction between Neville and Lupin, it could have been tight shot reverse shots, but instead the angles are staying pretty wide. There's a lot of the background still being introduced. For instance, in Neville's shot, you're still seeing the reaction of the students behind him. And with Lupin's shot, you're still seeing the cabinet behind him and a lot of the rest of the set behind him. So you're constantly in the world of the film, and it's always the character's relation to that world, which I really appreciate, given the contrast of what we see in the fourth one and what we will jump over to shortly. Another thing I want to talk about is with the cinematography. Michael Saracen mentioned that he loves and likes to adhere to a single source of light and to have that light be motivated strongly by including it somehow in the image. And that's what you can see here on this set. It's always frame right with those big glass windows. That's where the light is being motivated from and where the main source of light is shooting in from. And so it just helps to build some kind of consistency, and you're not confused about where the light is coming from. You're not confused about the temperature of light because it's just daylight. It helps to kind of bring some vibrancy into the set, especially with the dark woods and all of the props that they've brought in here. And, deciding what time of day it should be sometimes can't be attributed to the cinematographer, but there are other people involved in that. But you can tell that with, the variables involved here, he's doing a very good job of creating the look in this scene. When I did the third movie's analysis, I talked about just how punchy this film is. And for some of these shots, I imagine they brought in a lot of negative fill to bring in some negative to the left of these characters' faces. And yet everything just looks like it sets in really nicely. So I really like the contrast ratios, really liked how this one's looking. Let's jump on over to the fourth film and talk about that a little bit. Right off the bat, what we don't have are those nasty, disgusting diarrhea colors that are kind of permeated throughout some of the rest of the film. And once again, that's kind of just an inconsistency. Sometimes there's that unnatural, arbitrary, superficial green added into the film, and sometimes there isn't. But with this particular scene, I just want to highlight because it's the same, theoretically the same set, two different films, two different cinematographers, two different directors, and the biggest difference I feel like in this one definitely has to do with obviously the time of day they're deciding to shoot this, but also the motivation of light. If you notice, the big windows off to the right are meant to be the primary motivating source, and yet the amount of level on the characters' faces seems to be a little bit too bright, because every time it cuts off to like a wide angle or something revealing those windows, it's nearly pitch black out there. Almost looks like it's close to nighttime, and yet you get kind of the same amount of level as you do in the previous scene we just took a look at. So a little bit confusing on how we're getting this much level on their faces and why the fall off isn't more extreme than it is compared to the third one. Anytime it cuts to Professor Moody when he's tampering at the chalkboard. It's also a little bit unnatural that he has such a strong frontal light on him. It's hard to identify exactly where that source is coming from. So when you're looking at the students' faces, there appears to be a hair light coming in at them from the left, and then a pretty strong source to the right with not too big a fall off, kind of like what you might expect the fall off to be in a room like this, especially given how dim it is. And so I think sticking with a single source approach makes the setups a little bit more simple, but also the end result appear a little bit more natural. So that's going to be it for today. Thank you guys for sticking around, and look forward to analyzing the fifth one. And before we jump out here, I'm going to leave you with this image here. This is what we're getting into in the next video. Thanks. Have a good one.